welcome. Welcome to our panel, Smartphones and Wearables as Connected Bioinformatics Hubs, Security and Privacy Concerns. I'm your chair. We have a great panel for you here, and I'm going to introduce them momentarily. But first, I want to make some opening remarks. So obviously, unless your head has been in the sand, you're well aware that the General Data Protection Regulation will be enforced from 25th of May this year. And if you are in the healthcare industry, even tangentially, let's say you make a smartwatch that records bioinformatic information such as heart rate, blood pressure, that kind of thing, you will be aware that Article 9 does actually classify healthcare or health-related information, as well as other information, as a special category of personal data. And it also permits the member states to legislate beyond GDPR about controls around that data, restrictions on how you can use that data. And that's roughly analogous to what we have today in the Data Protection Directive in Article 8. And that may cause problems for some organizations, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit on the panel this morning. However, that is not the only piece of legislation that we need to really consider in this space. For example, there are new regulations and laws potentially on the horizon, both at the member state level and at the pan-European level. We obviously have the e-privacy regulation, and the presidency has just issued its document highlighting concerns it has with the draft text, and it's put out a red line version, an underlined version that you can download from the presidency website, and you can review that. And they are calling for communication and meetings with delegations and stakeholders. So you can expect to see quite a bit of activity around the e-privacy regulation this year. It's not going to come into force at the same time as GDPR was originally intended, but it will come into force at some point in the nearish future. And it could contain language that impacts the smart devices as bioinformatic hubs, especially when these hubs are communicating data back to cloud-based services or back to servers under the control of service providers. But there's also the forthcoming Cybersecurity Act. The draft text is out there. You can download and look at that, and in there's provision for certification. And there may be a demand for certification of certain consumer-grade devices, either by industry associations or just a general societal need for them in order to protect your interests. If you have a bioinformatic hub or a device, a wearable device that goes through certification, the theory is that maybe it will be safer and more secure and guarantee your privacy than one that has not by catching potential issues. And I'm sure we'll get to that as well during our presentation. So, I'm not going to speak any further. My name is Dr. Joan Howie. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer of Huawei's Consumer Business Group. I'm also a visiting professor at Edinburgh and Napier University in Scotland. And my role here today is simply to guide the panel along and be timekeeper. Make sure that we actually have some great questions, some great dialogue, and more importantly, give you, our audience, our esteemed audience, the opportunity to ask questions from the floor. So the flow will be, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator in a second after I've introduced the panel. And our moderator and the panelists will each have 5 minutes to talk about this topic, and then we will go straight into questions. And I'm just going to quietly sit here, keep track of time, and make sure that I move everyone along so that we have a great debate and you have a chance to ask your questions. So our moderator is Agnieszka Wawrzyk. I apologize.
Agnieszka Wawrzyk.
I apologize from the European Commission. I knew I was going to get that wrong, even though I practiced it. And then going down the panel, we have Dr. Hadi Asghari, who's Assistant Professor of Governance and Economics of Data Protection at the Delft University of Technology. Perfect, got that right. We have Joan Antokol, who is founder and managing partner of Park Legal LLC, based in New Jersey and Indiana. Is that correct? Perfect. And also you did a lot of work with the Canadian Ontario Privacy Commission, am I correct? Yes, perfect, okay. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Maarten Bodlaender, who's a general manager from Philips Security Technologies. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Agnieszka, and she's going to run the panel, and I'm just going to merrily keep time and move them along. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Joan. I know my name is very difficult and everyone has problems, so it's understandable. Today we will discuss how the smartphones and wearables are developing in the health care area. And I think as we see that the technology development is proceeding very fast in many areas, I think in the health area, and I see that a lot of other panels are also discussing health area and new technologies, the change there can be and will be tremendous. And it's already happening now. We have a lot of apps, now more well-being apps that are there that you can use for the self-monitoring of different kind of parameters. But the future, I sense, will be even going further. So we can have new medical devices that are more precise, that deliver more personalized services. We can have apps that communicate from the patient to the physician, and that give the physician kind of all the parameters regularly, so he or she can react if there is a problem. We can have monitoring apps or devices monitoring heart conditions. We can have self-monitoring devices that will help us to monitor our asthma level or diabetes, or if asthma attack is coming, because there are parameters that will, in our case, so very personalized, will show us that there are now conditions that can cause an attack. So all of this will help us a lot. But we have also discussion in the previous panels about apps and smartphones, and we have seen that there are many questions. It was a bit different topic because mostly our colleagues were discussing Uber, but we now in the health area, we are even more sensitive. Like John rightly pointed out, the health data are assumed as sensitive data under the GDPR. We have many other regulations in place that will affect it and hopefully make the environment better. But now, today, I would like to ask our panelists what we can do and what is needed so these apps and these wearables will actually deliver the service that we want to have, but also in a secured and data protection way. So our data are not leaking to anyone. And on one hand, that we are sure of the results, so then the system is secured, there is no attacks from the others. And taking into account that we will have so many new devices and they all will be connected, then we start to think, that's great, we can all contribute to have a very good diagnosis at the end, but that means also that there are many more points of access that might be vulnerabilities abused by someone else. So we have certainly concerns. And today I would like to ask the panelists in the introductory remarks to tell us whether we can move from this well-being stage when the results of the parameters and diagnosis and the apps, there are still certain level of discretion, to the fully fledged technology-enabled care health system with remote monitoring, with telehealth services. And if yes, what is needed at this stage? What do we have to deliver to be sure that it's protected and secured? And maybe I will start with Maarten.
Okay, thank you. So I think the short answer is yes. We will make that move, and maybe if we can bring up the one slide, then I'll also talk a little bit, why are we doing this? And so here you see what we call the care cycle in Philips. I mean, it's clear that we have an aging population that is healthier for longer, and just managing that for a large population is very costly. And we need to contain the cost of the healthcare system, while at the same time we want to increase the quality of care that we can give. So a transformation from our traditional healthcare system is needed to reach these goals. And connected care is really what has the promise to deliver that transformation successfully. So healthcare doesn't end at the hospital door. You will take it home, you will take it on the move, and there can be care moments everywhere. You can have more precise information that you can access faster, such that care professionals can take better decisions with less work. And also by delivering these care systems everywhere, you can also empower people to take more control over their own health. And that's all very important transformation that we see coming. And connected care will make that possible. But like you say, you can see here now that the system that delivers the care is not in one place anymore. It's spread across the society. Yeah? It's mobile, it's home, it's hospital. And indeed, if you look at this with the intent to do damage, then there are many more places where you can try to attack the system. And while maybe in a hospital setting there are professionals that can manage the system, if something goes wrong, they can run to the device, lock it down. When that device is somewhere across the globe, then that's much more difficult. There will not be a professional manager close there that can take care of the security. So you will need to do that remotely. And also in a home setting, you will be faced with consumers that have very limited understanding of the requirements placed on them in terms of cybersecurity. And if you put too many requirements on them, it will go wrong. And also because you're managing large populations, it will go wrong. I mean, it's just a matter of statistics. You will need to manage, I call that post-compromise management. You will need to manage situations where something has occurred, and then what? So, it's very clear that to make this transformation a reality and to reach the promise of connected care, then security is front and center, and we need to tackle that.
Thank you, Maarten. So we need to do it. We need to move because the patients are expecting it, and also to allow better healthcare with a bit less cost, possibly. You said also that it will empower the people and allow them to take care of their own health status. But also, with the spread system, we need to make sure that the security management can be done also remotely to not only avoid the breaches or any other attacks, but also to manage them when they happen, because statistically they will most probably happen.
Yeah, that's right. I think at the recent Decipher Symposium in the Netherlands, it was said that we are now enjoying the fruits of digitization. There's a lot of benefit, but we're not yet paying the full cost. And the full cost is working on cybersecurity, handling that. And we will need to shift resources to that. Philip's very actively doing that right now.
Thank you so much. Now we move to Joan with a bit more legal perspective, I assume.
Hello, everyone. Well, it's no secret that the market for wearable medical devices is absolutely exploding. The predictions are that by 2021, it will be a $12.4 billion market, and just 4 years later, in 2025, the expectation is $25 billion, double. Right now, the U.S. market is about 1/3 of those amounts. The prediction for the U.S. is $4.5 billion by 2020. As mentioned by Maarten, there are many reasons for the attractiveness of wearable medical devices. Convenience is one. Increased health awareness. People are becoming more conscious about proactive medical care and taking care of themselves and remaining fit. It's also kind of cool and trending among young people to wear medical devices such as Fitbits and Google Glasses in the U.S. In the U.S., a very large percentage of our gross national product is attributed to healthcare costs. So our costs are staggering and increasing all the time, and the expectation is that these devices will not only improve health outcomes, but also help to reduce medical costs, for instance, by having people out of the hospital and not having to go to the doctor because they have the device on. So the devices are impacting a broad range of populations in the U.S. Geriatric patients are using them to remain self-sufficient or to an increasing extent self-sufficient in their homes and be able to monitor their care, take their pills, call someone if they're having a medical problem. Teenagers and athletes, healthy population members are using the devices for fitness and to monitor their health overall. Chronically ill patients and disease patients are using the devices to monitor, for instance, glucose and breathing for asthmatics. And also the devices are being used more and more broadly in the clinical research context to monitor patients remotely rather than sending them to the trial site. And this, of course, improves healthcare because not all patients are located near trial sites, so more can participate. And surprisingly, the devices are also being used for infants right now. So there are many types of monitors in use. I mentioned glucose monitoring, Alzheimer's, vital signs. I've even worked on one involving psychiatric patients where they can input information about depression to help prevent suicide. And also the devices are showing up in many places on the body. We're thinking of these devices around the wrist, but many are worn around the neck and sometimes a vest or wearable clothing that can cover many parts of the body. And Google also has new contact lenses to help monitor in the case of diabetics. So all locations. There are many risks that are associated with wearable medical devices. For example, there are many parties involved who have access to the data. The individual who's wearing the device often has access to their own information, as well as the healthcare provider, health insurance companies. Many times employers in the U.S. have wellness programs where they either provide these devices or encourage their workforce to participate and use them. In those cases, oftentimes there's a data warehouse where the information is collected and used for big data purposes, aggregating the data in different ways. Cloud providers store the data, and many third-party subcontractors. So by definition, when you have lots of different parties touching the data and many different transfers, there's more risk based upon those reasons alone. In addition, sometimes the developers will develop a separate standalone device, and sometimes it's even showing up in collaboration with designers, like I think Hermes and some of the other companies now are designing jewelry with these devices, so it looks nice when you're wearing it. But many times these devices are installed on smartphones, and smartphones are not secure. As we know, there are many vulnerabilities. Individuals are downloading other apps on the same smartphone, many of which are free and contain malware. So there's a potential for compromise, even if the app itself is secure. And then if you're transferring medical data from the app to a third-party provider, a doctor or a hospital or clinical research site, there's a potential for that malware to flow into the medical organizations. As mentioned, we're dealing with sensitive health data, so that's another significant risk here. And there's a safety potential, a great one here, both in terms of the individual, a targeted attack on someone who's using this device for health-sustaining purposes, such as a diabetic, and also widespread compromise. So for instance, if all the devices were not working in a particular area, that could cause regional problems as well. And health data, of course, has to be retained long-term, so long-term retention coming from these devices also has inherent risks in that. On the U.S. side, there's a mishmash of U.S. laws that apply to these wearable medical apps, and it's not very clear to individuals. And I work in this area a lot with many startups and larger organizations, so it's quite complicated. The FDA governs medical devices and pharmaceuticals, biologics in the U.S. and food and drug, but the regulations aren't clear for mobile medical apps. They've divided into 3 categories: those that don't fall under the FDA's jurisdiction, those that do, but they won't exercise enforcement authority because it's not going to have a significant impact, and then those that are considered to be medical devices. So the FDA gets involved in data protection somewhat and controls advertising and labeling and so forth associated with the apps. The second body, regulatory body in the U.S. is the Office of Civil Rights, which governs HIPAA, the federal health privacy laws, HIPAA and high-tech, and that may apply or may not apply, depending on whether the organization, such as doctors and hospitals, are a so-called covered entity or business associate, essentially a controller or a processor. And there's a third category called vendors of personal health records, which isn't really clear whether these entities that manufacture devices fall under that category.
Maybe we can get into some of that as we go on. So I'm going to call time on you right there.
Okay.
Okay,
And
sorry.
of course, the GDPR complicates things even more, and then the notice requirements are very significant in terms of privacy and security and how the notice is conveyed to individuals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You gave us quite a good presentation about the possible different devices and different applications. Thank you for that. And you draw our attention to the risks behind and showed us how it is not exactly well regulated, or not sure how it is regulated in the US. So the legal framework is not well set in stone, I would say, or not yet attached to these devices. But I will now give the floor to Hadi to give us a bit more academic approach to the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I agree with all the comments so far that this will present a very exciting and kind of new opportunity moving into healthcare, telehealth, mHealth, all of these. And I think from all these different reasons that were mentioned, that I think it will get adopted. And so the question that I'm mostly focused on is like the data protection of it. And I think what we know from about maybe 2 decades of research into security economics is that the technology is complex, but in the end, almost always security failures are because of wrong incentives or not having the right people involved. It always comes down to these. I mean, I can discuss hours on these points, but if you just look at any major security incident in the last few years, it always comes down to simple problems. It was like systems being unpatched, like with the WannaCry case. Bad passwords, like in DigiNotar. You have data that was unencrypted. You have databases that weren't sufficiently separated. These are, which allowed the attacker to escalate very quickly. So of course, there are also, these spectacular vulnerabilities that come out once in a while, like Heartbleed, Meltdown, etc. But actually, the security community is pretty good at handling those, and they rarely turn into any problem. Always the problems are these actually simple things that we know how to do. So the question is, how do we fix this? And as I said, it comes down to getting the incentives right, making sure best practices are followed, etc. So for this, I think, the GDPR already offers, I think, a very good starting point on kind of changing some of these incentive structures. But can we think more into the future, or can we think of more governance mechanisms? One of them, I think, this point about certification, and in particular, some kind of co-regulated certification scheme for all kind of mHealth devices and apps. It could be a voluntary certification, but the key point is that the certification body needs to have the right mix. And that includes probably the DPAs or some people from the regulatory side. It definitely needs industry leaders. And I think it needs people from academia on it and some people from healthcare. And what they will be doing is they will actively investigate a product. That includes looking at the data protection impact assessment for the product and seeing if the state of the art is being followed. It also includes, I think it should be an ongoing certification, so it should be kind of yearly, and they have to look, did the vendor actually patch devices in the last year, or are they just pushing stuff out and then not patching these devices? And I think most importantly, what we know in security is you have to be able to see inside of the product. So you have to be able to verify that actually the product does what it does, and that means either it has to be released as open source, or if it can't be open source, then at least the certification body or the group of experts in that need to be able to see the source. They need to be able to have a way to verify what data is being sent, that privacy-enhancing techniques are being used, etc. And this is kind of the idea, is to kind of flip the accountability. So instead of getting caught all the time afterwards, caught up and then saying, hey, why didn't we do this? Why not flip this and kind of make it easy to kind of see a lot of these things up front? And in some ways, you could say some of these thoughts already exist in the GDPR, but as I said, the idea is can we make it more systematic, and can we also make it broader? So can we turn this into some kind of community effort? So this is point one. And then I think that body can then come up with best practices. It can handle all these risks that you pointed out, and they could actually really look into them. There are many people also in academia who are studying these risks, and it's really, can we get these together and can we do something about it? Now, I have a second suggestion. I hope I have time to...
Could I, before we lose it, could I react to the first point that you make?
I would like to make my second point first. Sorry for that. The second point is to think further into the future, after we get the security right, after we get the basic economics right. We have these devices. Big data always promises scientific breakthroughs. And another problem we've had is that the data that's collected, given all the risks, in the end, it's shared with many people, but it's not shared with academics. And maybe this is a more controversial request, but can we have industry pledge to release the data as an open data format available to universities and research institutes, so that there can be breakthrough scientific research done, of course, given all the privacy techniques, including the identification, consent, etc., etc. But I think that's really important if we want, the full promise of kind of mHealth to be delivered to society.
Thank you, Hadi. You touched upon a lot data protection in GDPR and how to enforce it somehow with the help of the community. And you also talked about sharing the data with the academics for improving the possibility for research. Before I continue with some of the follow-up questions, I will give the floor to Maarten.
Yeah, because it started out saying it's not about the technology, and I'm actually working a lot on security technology, so I have to disagree here. and I think the WannaCry example is a good example of everybody who didn't patch very fast was hacked, right? It's all their fault. So stupid, didn't immediately hack. But actually, I think it was a month later, we had NotPetya, and everybody who quickly patched was hacked. Because the malware came in through the patch. It's not so simple. Yeah, and I think that right now, I consider a lot of our technologies that we have still in the Stone Age, very early days, where a user clicking on any email link with a single button click can destroy the security of your entire system. I don't consider that a very well-designed system. So, yes, you're right. I mean, weak passwords are, of course, stupid of these users, but who designed that system that allowed a weak password to destroy the security of that system. So I do believe that we still have many years to come where we should actually invest much more in developing robust solutions that place less of a burden on us humans, such that we can start doing the things we really want to do. We want to focus on healthcare, not on 20 different passwords. And so I do think that's a very underestimated area. I heard it many times because it's, of course, not a nice subject to think about technologies. It's very far away from your end user. But we need to get also that part right. Otherwise, we will always be burdened by the end user that we have to take so many things into account that, frankly, I think technology should handle for us.
Yeah, so I fully agree with what you're saying. I think I need to clarify a bit more my point. So this is obviously a technological problem, or technology plays a big role in it, and obviously we need to get the technology right, including, you know, the UX design aspects. I agree with your earlier point about some of this stuff should be, the burden should be removed from the user. It should be moved more to automation or intermediaries. So I'm not questioning any of that. But the point is the number of software vulnerabilities is almost infinite. Yearly, we have hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities being found, and these are just the ones we know of. We cannot fix everything. And there is a constant cat and mouse game going on, right? There's always going to be attackers coming up with new techniques. So it is true that we need the technology, but we need to know which technology to fix, where to put the resources, and that, whenever you look at it, it comes down to the incentives. We know how to do a lot of this, or there are a lot of people studying these things and they know how to do it, but do they have the incentives? Does the company allow them? Who is liable? You know, these are the things, if you look at it, but I mean, there were many examples, I think, in the past days here of, yesterday, for instance, or today, of companies saying all the things they're doing, which are actually, you know, really technically advanced stuff. And then the question comes, what is their incentives to do that? And that is the thing I'm talking about. It's kind of, how can we design those incentives? And certification can be an incentive structure. Also, accountability. How do we know that they did the best that they could have done? So that is the point I'm saying. I'm not questioning the technology. I absolutely agree with the technology. But I'm saying from a governance perspective, from a policy perspective, we have to let people who know how to do the technology do that part.
Yeah, but I consider that the major issue is that you have this life cycle of products. Yeah, you have the hospital, you have all the on-the-move products, the home products, and any of these components that we integrated into this overall system could be hit at any time with one of these vulnerabilities that you mentioned. And so it's impossible right now to buy a component and get the absolute guarantee that it won't be broken. So I wonder how certification can help me there. Because after certification, I still won't have that guarantee that it won't be broken.
Can we think of something that could help us to secure the system, not particular devices? And I will give the floor to Joan.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that a lot of these apps are being developed by small startup companies that don't have the budget or the expertise of major multinationals like Philips. And so they're doing the best they can with very limited resources and sometimes venture capital, so they have to report to third-party organizations about how they're spending the money. And then they're hiring attorneys sometimes, if they have the budget, to help them. And many of the attorneys don't have expertise in these areas, and those that do are sometimes struggling as well because the laws aren't entirely clear. As I mentioned, or you have multiple sets of regulators to deal with, the FDA and those issues. That's a specialized area in the US. You have the FTC, you have the Office of Civil Rights, you have the state attorney generals, and then if you're going to be developing these apps internationally, you have the GDPR and many other laws. So So even if your heart is in the right place, sometimes there are challenges associated with it. And for organizations that have a breach, the organization sometimes thinks that they're a victim because there's some sophisticated malware that attacked them, but it isn't the way the regulators see it. And in 2020 hindsight, looking back, they say, well, you should have done this, this, and this, and slap them with a huge fine, and then there's class action lawsuits. So sometimes it's not financially or in their best interest financially to even bother developing these apps because of all the risks.
Any response how to create such system that is secure?
So from our point of view, naturally we want to work towards more robust systems, but that's going to be we're going to be in that for the long haul, right? And in the meantime, it's very clear that you need a strong management structure on top of that, be able to react the moment that a compromise is being taken place. I mean, meltdown occurs, and directly in Philips there will be processes starting up saying, okay, what does that mean for the systems we have out in the field? What does that mean for our developments? I mean, do we have processors in our products that are vulnerable? If so, yes, what are we going to do about it? You need to do a risk analysis, etc., etc. So you very much actively need to manage these systems, given the fact that we know that, yeah, at any time a new vulnerability can occur. And that's right now, I think, the way forward. So you have, of course, you do your security by design processes as good as you can. Actually, in Philips, then, once the product is finished, we do an internal test before we release it to the market. So we do in-house penetration testing, whether we can find vulnerabilities, then it put on the market, and then still you need that active management once it's in the field. And that's how we try to structure that and improve that. But it's definitely something that will take continuous attention, and it's not like you're doing it once and you're done with it.
So I think that this is indeed going to be a problem with the way that software has been developed, I think, in the last 20 years. It's also why we have so much security problems. And one of the things that certification body could do is actually collect these best practices that, for instance, places like Philips have been doing a lot of work in creating them and make them available to startups. And that also could include code. So it could include, for instance, testing code. How do you ensure something is actually secure, there's no leaks, etc. It could come from other parts of the community. And I think it would be creating like this kind of body of knowledge for the startups to be able to reach into and kind of, and then the question will be, did they do their due diligence? Did they use that? And if they did, then, they've done their duty to care.
We talk a lot about a different way to manage the security of the system, and that brings me, I think Hadi also mentioned it, to the question, who should be liable and who should be responsible to make sure that the system is secured? So I'm sure there will be some divergence of opinions, but should it be the patient that didn't do the update? Shouldn't be the physician that will receive the data and then how he handle it? Should it be the designer? Should it be the producer of the device?
Shall I start? So first with a personal irritation. I bought this beautiful iPhone with this beautiful user interface, and then I installed the security update, and then suddenly I had new age, Jony Ive, ugly user interface. I just wanted the security update. Yeah, and so that's one of the things that I would have liked to have the option not to get a different user interface, because now with every update I do, my phone is suddenly not what I bought it anymore. So that's one thing that, whether you say, is it an automatic application of an update? Let's face it, an update changes the functionality of your device, not necessarily for the better, right? I mean, Apple phones also get slower when you update, things like that. So, and in certain cases, malware comes in with an update. So it used to be best practice, and in many cases, it's still best practice that when an update arrives, it's first tested in a non-production environment for a couple of weeks before you put it live. So how do you combine that best practice that we used to have with, hey, you didn't patch it in one day? It's a very difficult issue, I think. So in many cases, in the Internet of Things devices, they hardly have a user interface. And as a company, we have no good method to contact the user telling him even there is an update. Yeah, I mean, you need a two-way dialogue. And in an iPhone or in a phone, that's easy, right? I mean, it will tell you, hey, there's a new update. Do you want to install it out tonight? Blah, blah, blah. But how do you do that in a small device that's just silently sitting in the corner and doesn't have such a rich interface? That's not very well arranged. And so I can imagine in certain cases you want to do that automatically, just to keep it safe. In other cases, I can imagine that actually there might be risks to having automated updates. So I think that's one. When it comes to responsibility, I think it's very clear that you have a supply chain leading up to a system. There's many parties in there. And any party that would be able to disturb the functionality of the system through their actions is responsible. Yeah, and it can be a sub-component supplier that still, if that was hacked and it actually released malware in its final component, I mean, it has happened, can then basically bring the security of the entire system at risk. So it's the entire supply chain that is responsible. Now, when it comes to liability, I think that's a very different thing, and it's a very much a legal method to enforce that people pay attention, right? What I heard before I thought was very interesting, and I'm not sure how it applies to GDPR, but it's very dangerous to make somebody liable for the actions of a malicious hacker who wants to harm you, because you've just given that hacker an extra weapon to hurt you. And I think whenever you play around with liability, you should keep that in the back of your mind.
Oh, and I'd just like to add that I think there are competing interests here as well that have to be taken into account. So if you're dealing with patients, it's hard to put the blame on them. In some of these situations, you're dealing with elderly patients who aren't as computer savvy as younger people. They may have an outdated computer that one of their children set up for them in the house. It may not have all the latest security patches on it. I remember going to an elderly friend's house, and she referred to the password as a clue. My husband put a clue on this, and I can't get into this laptop. So, you know, they're not as savvy, and then you're dealing with vulnerable patients, and at least in the U.S., sometimes the less affluent patients have more health conditions, they're not eating as healthy and so forth, and so they may not have the resources to buy up-to-date technology in order to use in association with these medical devices and wearable apps. And then in some of the EU countries, the definition of controller versus processor varies. At least right now, I'm not sure how it will turn out under the GDPR, but in the medical context, at least right now, sometimes a recipient of medical information is considered a joint controller as opposed to a processor. Because they have independent rights in association with the data, and that's very important under the GDPR in terms of breach notification and responsibility. So all of those issues have to be sorted out as well in the medical apps context.
So there are two remarks I'd like to make. So first one is, I think liability comes down to not the fact that there was a breach, but whether there was the provider had done the duty to care. So did they, you know, and I think that's also how I read the GDPR, you know, like, and in that sense, I'm not sure it would be a weapon. I actually think it's a pretty reasonable thing. And of course it's a legal question to some extent, but from an economical perspective, liability should be with the party that can do the most about it. That is the most efficient way to assign it. Which means not the end user, obviously, because they don't have the technical knowledge, but typically with intermediaries. And actually, if you look at a lot of the other parts of the tech industry, a lot of the leading tech companies, they actually kind of absorb this responsibility onto themselves to protect their users without even, there being that liability in place because they just can do something about it. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the audience because we would like to engage you with the discussion. So if we have questions, we will take them now.
Hello, my name is Miriam Roenstroot. I run Mobil Sicher, which is a website that gives consumer information on smartphone security. And we also test apps and also test health apps a lot. And what we see is that all those health apps, they always, for instance, a diabetes app, you give your values, what disease you have, and they always load it up to their server. And when we ask why they're doing it, it's so they can use it on different devices. So my question is mainly to Philips. Under GDPR, shouldn't there be? Is this an excuse or a valuable reason to access health data to give the function of using it on different devices? And if yes, shouldn't there be the necessity to make it a zero-knowledge approach, so to encrypt this data so that even you as Philips couldn't read it? And do you plan to do this in your health approach?
That's a lot of questions. So I think that it's clear that using apps to transfer, let's say, measurements that you do at home to a healthcare setting has a lot of advantages potentially. And I can't say for the specific apps you've seen whether these advantages are real or not, but I assume that we're working here towards a healthcare system where the care is improved. And if showing data on multiple devices is essential for that, well, we can debate that, but I think you really need to look at a particular case. I think in general, especially when you get older, it's very normal that you have chronic conditions that you will need to manage for a long time, and things like tight control are important to improve your healthcare outcome, for example, with diabetes. So I can imagine that done right, there is a lot of advantage to the health condition of people with diabetes, of tracking their glucose levels and whatnot very accurately.
Yes, but why not on device? Why does it need to go in the cloud of the server?
No, I think that's a good question. For me, it's not totally obvious that everything should be uploaded to the big data lake if that's not necessary. And like you say, specific encryption techniques to minimize the risk of data leakage, yeah, you should look at that. So we recently had the Norwegian news where I think 50% of the Norwegians had some of their healthcare data stolen with just one compromise. Again, I think this is a case where the technology failed us. Who designed the system to bring 50% of the healthcare data in one place where it can be stolen all at once? Maybe it should have been kept more distributed. Maybe we should have had, I don't know, zero knowledge type of tricks to make it more difficult to get all that data at the same time. And I think that's why I'm saying it's not just, there is also a serious technology component to this. It's not only technology, it will not be enough. We know the attackers are stronger than the defenders at this time. So there's a lot of processes, things around there, but you should also keep investing in building more secure systems that minimize these risks and also minimize the impact.
Anyone else would like to add to the answer? It was clearly to Maarten, but maybe...
Maybe there's a way to secure this data the same way that employers are securing their own data on portable devices that are given to employees, like bring your own device, where it's encrypted and where if the employee removes the password or any of the security controls on the device, then automatically they're no longer allowed to access the employer's email system or other databases through that device. So those are some of the areas that could be implemented perhaps by app manufacturers in order to help safeguard the information. The other thing is that with globalization, at least in the US, there are fewer health insurance organizations, a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and so the data naturally ends up in these very large databases just for those reasons alone. So it's hard to conceptualize how we're going to use the data in a collective way, yet store it in small batches in different places so that you don't have these major security incidents.
I'd also like to briefly add, I fully agree with the comment, and I think, I'm hoping with data protection impact assessments becoming mandatory, actually this would be a very serious question that the maker of the device has to answer. Why are they making it this way?
Thank you. Achim?
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah. Achim Klabunda, I'm working for the European Data Protection Supervisor. And I have two elements which I would want to raise. One is the general topic of the discussion. The Commission published in September a communication on cybersecurity where it announced to analyze the issues of continuous liability, duty of care, and these things. And I would like to ask the panel whether they have examples from other jurisdictions, like in the US, what already exists, or in other areas of which the panelists are aware. The second point is a question relating to Maarten's concerns about updates. You stated that patching to be immune against WannaCry would have opened your system for PETIA, which seems to be a different view than that of most security experts who have analyzed the matches. So I would really like to understand on what basis you made this assertion. Thank you.
Yes, a number of regulatory oversight agencies in the U.S. have issued guidance documents on cybersecurity. The FDA has issued a guidance document for cybersecurity in the context of medical devices, which is the closest that applies here. And then the FTC has issued information on cybersecurity as well as ransomware, and also the Office for Civil Rights. So ransomware is another big risk associated with this, and one that has to be addressed as well. So lots of different guidance documents with a lot of overlap, and also NIST, the National Institute of Security and Technology, has guidance documents as well.
If I may, does this indicate that there is a liability when you don't follow this guidance? Is that the case?
Guidance documents are not the same as regulations in the U.S. as in other countries, but yes, there's an inference that if these are the expectations of the regulators, and if you're not following their expectations, then at least arguably you're in violation of the standards. So the FTC enforces privacy and security under Section 5 of the FTC Act, deceptive and unfair trade practices. So this can be used as evidence that you didn't uphold your security standards in the representations made to consumers or end users, that you're providing adequate security for these devices.
One area that I think I'm aware of that it's been, the issue of duty to care and liability has been studied, is with bot infections, and in particular what internet service providers can do there. Might be something to look in. There's a kind of quite some literature.
So when it comes to patching, yeah, obviously if you are 3 patch rounds behind and you are relying on a piece of software with a known vulnerability already for half a year, there's no excuse, right? I mean, then you're just low-hanging fruit for an attacker. But it is the case, and I think that's important to understand, whenever you add a security function to the system, like automated patching or like a virus scanner or those kind of things, and that's actually not managed by you all yourself, but by a third party, you do become reliant on the security of that third party. So when NotPetya came in, it was clear that the Maersk was actually compromised through the patching mechanism. Then when that was discussed in Philips, said, whoa, how many suppliers do we have that push their patches to us? And if you start counting, it becomes rather scary how large your attack surface is. So I'm not saying I have the solution here, but just blindly saying you need to patch immediately does put you to full exposure. Yeah, so the traditional practice of first testing whether the patch you receive is right and doesn't break your systems is actually, it was there for a reason, and that reason hasn't gone away. So patching, I think, is a much more complicated issue than a lot of people give it credit. It's not that simple. For example, we can say, well, you know, and I think the Belgian consumer authority was saying, well, obviously, a company needs to supply patches over the full economic lifetime of the product. That's obvious, and it sounds obvious. So we're going to make a European legislation saying, well, you know, the economic lifetime of this product, consumer product, is 2 years, so you need to supply patches for 2 years. Done. That was easy. It's not actually that easy, because I can hire a 15-year-old to create a patch in 1 day that shifts the hole from left to right. Still there, the hole, of course, but it's different. And I say, well, look, I have my obligation here. Oh, so now we're going to have to legislate what's a good patch. I can tell you that's much more difficult to do. And then there's the case, Apple had that, and they were trying to patch their iPhone 4 because it was every time jailbroken, and in the end they decided, we need different hardware. It's just impossible to create a patch, and I think Meltdown is another example. In certain cases, it's impossible to release a patch that will fully solve the issue. So how can you then make legislation? I think another issue with patching is where in the past, when Philips was still also selling light bulbs, now we are 2 companies, we will always get the criticism from people saying, you built these light bulbs to break on purpose such that you can sell more. But with patching, that's now the reality. Yeah, the moment a company stops patching its products after the economic lifetime of the product, if you keep using it, you're stupid. You're not somebody trying to save money. No, you're stupid. You're still using Windows XP. I mean, you just Google that, how many hits you get on that one, right? So, and as more and more products are now becoming digitized, so our water cooker is now on the internet, our toothbrush is on the internet, lots of things, it's useful to have a digital function. But it also means that we now are introducing planned obsolescence for a large part of our economy. And that's probably, just from an economic standpoint, is actually very costly. So I think the patching issue is a very interesting issue, and we should have another panel session on that. But it's not easy as people think.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions.
You talked a lot about health data in the area of healthcare. There is a lot of health data. My Garmin, I run, I get statistics. In a couple of years, I will have a car that will know my BMI, position of my seat, the pressure on the seat will determine completely my height. It will measure my weight. It will know my heart rate. It will know my tension in my body, how stressed I am. So that's quite a lot of data. All those technologies are there. They are not yet on the market. But how will that sufficiently be regulated? Because it's not typical healthcare. Before you know that data from the car is with your insurance company and has a pretty high impact on you.
Who wants to get this question?
Yeah, I agree completely. There are all those challenges, and some of that data is being collected already, and unbeknownst to the individuals. The more data that's collected about the individual, the more that organizations, at least theoretically, can build a whole profile of the person. And of course, this would be very interesting to employers and to insurance companies. Could be used to discriminate against individuals based upon future health problems and the cost and missed days of work and so forth. On the other hand, some of this data can be useful to improve the individual's health. So it goes back, of course, to the notice issues as well, and also to anticipate in the notice how the data may be used in the future and who it will be given to, at least in identifiable or pseudonymized form that could be reattributed to the individual. So lots of interesting questions that you raised with no good answers right now.
So again, borrowing from economics, I think this is a classic agency problem. So if the device is your agent, is it acting in your interest, or is it acting in some other person's interests, maybe your employer or the insurers? And I think that comes, at least again, the way I read the GDPR, I think partially, you know, that question in the GDPR is being more clearly pushed towards the user. And it's not towards that the device has to, you know, take into account mostly, I would say, the benefits of the user. And the other part comes down to openness, so to the accountability issue. Do we know when your agent is not acting in your interests, and how can we know that? And I think that's kind of why the privacy community is kind of pushing for algorithmic accountability and that aspect to kind of solve it. So I think there is a solution. The solution lies in accountability.
I think it's also a matter of who do you trust with your data, and what are they going to do with it. So from a Philips point of view, we have made very clear guidelines on how to deal with personal data, and that includes, for example, minimization of data. Yeah, don't collect what you don't need. Indeed, explain clearly what you're going to do with that data. If your customer doesn't like what you're going to do with data, you're likely to lose the trust of that customer. So we are custodians of that data, and we want to earn that trust. And so we, of course, we secure that data. That's a very important aspect of it. And then I think in the end, there will always be companies that well, play a little bit more fast and loose with your data and maybe vote with your feet.
And we have the last question, because then we have to wrap up.
Okay, I'll do my best to keep it brief. Hi, I'm Lucy. I work for Access Now, which is a digital rights NGO. So thank you all for participating, and I think the issue of liability that we discussed at length is very current for those of us working in Brussels, so thanks for your insight. My question, actually, one of them is a little off topic, but I think it's very relevant, especially when we're talking about like remote monitoring of patients and helping certain communities access healthcare. I'm wondering, in your field, do you come across the impact, studies on the social impacts of this? Because I know, especially for the elderly, a lot of the times the kind of interaction with their social workers and with their doctors is key to maintaining their sort of mental health. So I wonder do you see enough in your sector being done about this and kind of exploring the long-term effects of these technologies on these populations, the elderly, vulnerable communities, which already have very limited access? And second, I think life cycle of the technologies is fundamental for mHealth. It's central to the debate. My grandfather had one heart rate monitor his entire life, post-communism in Czech Republic. It was super expensive to get. And I don't think he would have been able to keep up with any new technology that would have come during his lifetime because of the status. So I wonder, how do you see the responsibility of the producers, especially when we're talking about devices which it's not just a fun Fitbit for me as a young person to wear, but when we're talking about things like heart monitors and things that are really integral for people. It also goes for mobile applications. I agree with you that there's a lot of disparity in the way that applications are regulated, but I mean, it's essential if I'm using an application to track vital health data for myself and that application disappears with my data or doesn't ensure proper data portability. who can I complain to? And what's the liability of the person who made me sign up for the service? So thanks.
Quick response from my side. I think when you work with apps, trust the company that you get the app from. Then I think a company like Philips that has been around for 100 years won't disappear next month. I don't expect that, at least. But a lot of these startups, yeah, of course, if a startup doesn't make it, they go bankrupt. And you know what happens when they're bankrupt? Then usually people are unhappy. Strange things happen. Security keys get sold. Databases suddenly disappear on hard disks. So yeah, there's a risk working with startups. And if you care about that, maybe don't work with them, with your personal data.
Yeah, I think there can be a very positive impact, social impact from these wearable devices. Keeps people out of the hospital. A lot of people die in the hospital from infections and medical errors, so reducing that risk. You're allowing people to stay home with their families, and you're allowing elderly people to remain more self-sufficient if their heart monitor fails, or if they're not taking their medicine, or they lose their way if they have Alzheimer's disease, and these devices can help regulate them, even if they are on their own. And, you know, we may ultimately see some use of this in the dating context, where individuals can post a certification or something about their health based upon this information. Who knows, you know, what will be the next uses of this information for the population.
Okay, thank you so much. I will try to wrap up very briefly in 1 minute. We have talked about connected healthcare, whether we need it, whether we go there, and I think from the panel I sense that the answer is yes. We have concerns, and because there is a lot of cybersecurity risk, but I sense from the panel that there is a lot of understanding of the GDPR requirements, and this is the way to deliver a bit of the trust that we also talked about. Who are we trusting with our data, whether they follow the basic principles of data protection or not. We talked quite a lot about the liability, and I think this is still the avenue that we have to discuss further, maybe for the next year. We talked about security by design, and then we talked about the big companies. They already do it, and they already testing a lot of products, so they're trying to release the product that is mature. But on the other hand, we were talking about the economy of these SMEs and startups that maybe are not in this privileged position to do it. And we had an interesting proposal to create some sort of best practices to have available for SMEs and startups based on the certification. I think there is a lot of appetite for the Cybersecurity Act, and we can draw some lessons from the US market that Joan told us quite a lot about. And the last thing, we talked also that it's not only about data protection and data security, but also ultimately about the safety of the patients.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank Agnieszka for being our very excellent moderator today and giving us a very dynamic panel with some great input and thoughts. I'd like to thank each of the panelists as well, Hadi, Joan, and Maarten. Thank you so very much for taking time out your schedules to come be with us today. I really appreciate it. And thank you, our audience, for sticking with us. I know that lunch is being served and some of you want to go there, so we're going to finish early so you can go get in line. So a round of applause, please. Thank you very much.